And thank you everyone for showing up to this great event. We're super excited to hear from Cory. My name is Ellie Jackson, and I am a senior here at MSU, and I'm the outgoing director of the Heart Initiative. And I'll have Talia, our incoming director, give a brief introduction as well.
Hey everyone, my name is Talia. I am the incoming director of the Heart Initiative. This is Megan. She's our incoming assistant director. And we are a student organization at MSU that raises awareness about human trafficking in Montana and beyond. Our mission is to foster conscious awareness of human trafficking occurring in Montana and globally, aid those working towards eliminating trafficking, and promote a community of compassion and respect. We do so through collaboration with Gallatin County Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force, presentations, and events like these. And I'd like to thank the Honors Presents team, the Office of the Dean of Students, the Women's Center, and the Voice Center for co-sponsoring this event.
Awesome, thanks Talia. So yeah, I will introduce Cory here. He has a very impressive resume. So Cory is a advocate for civil and human rights, a former fellow of the Polk Institute for Global Development at the University of Notre Dame, and former vice president of policy, advocacy, and communications for Kids in Need of Defense. His lecture tonight will focus on the growing anti-immigrant sentiment and the various ways this makes providing services to any immigrants, even the most vulnerable and sympathetic, much more difficult. The recent escalating bias has meant U.S. laws and policies have resulted in less services, fewer legal protections, and vital funding for immigrant victims and survivors of human trafficking. Throughout the lecture, feel free to enter any of your questions in the chat, and Cory will get to your questions later this evening during the Q&A portion of our event. And also, if you are an honors student attending for credit this evening, we will give you the link to enter your attendance at the end of the event tonight. So with that being said, I'd like to welcome Cory. So thanks again for joining us.
Great, thank you. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ellie, and thank you, Talia, for your work and your organization's work. I also want to say thank you to Montana State University for having me, the Heart Initiative, the Office of the Dean of Students, the Women's Center, the Voice Center, and MSU Honors. And honors students, make sure you get credit for your attendance. I'm really happy to be here, and I really appreciate your time. I'm going to talk tonight, as Ellie mentioned, and as has been put in the promotional materials, just about the challenges within human trafficking for addressing labor trafficking and immigrants, foreign nationals. And I've worked on human trafficking for about 12 years in different aspects and different angles. My first work, I was really fortunate because I worked with a coalition called the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking. And I say fortunate because the beauty of that coalition was it was a coalition to address all forms of trafficking. So sex trafficking, labor trafficking, trafficking of women and girls, trafficking of men and boys, trafficking domestically, trafficking internationally, all the significant aspects, U.S. citizens and foreign nationals. And at that time, this was probably around 2008, 2009, a lot of divides or cleavages had happened within the human trafficking movement. People were kind of looking at different populations, and they were really focused on those populations and not a holistic or an inclusive approach. And so what we really worked on is facilitating everyone to work together, and kind of the rising tide will lift all ships and focus on protection, prevention, partnerships. And so that was work that was really important to me. And I think at the outset, I want to say that I don't have a bias or preference for any class of victims within or survivors within human trafficking. All I want is that wherever the resources, the policy, the funding goes, is based on evidence. And, what's the problem? I think it's a real unfortunate thing that there's been some of these divides within the movement. And you don't see that, I don't think, that often in other uh, rights issues, other, popular victims and survivors. And so what I want to do is just a little bit of trafficking, talk about immigration, and talk about some of the policies that have been enacted in the last few years, I think, that have really shown a disparity in how we address the problem with, sex versus labor trafficking. So I just want to say again at the beginning that all this is really important. And what I've seen is people that work on trafficking, when they work on it, the more time you spend, the more you realize that it's all so important, and it's horrific, and it's a huge challenge. But there's an extraordinary amount of people like yourselves all around the country, all around the world, that are doing incredible work, and there's so much goodwill and so much interest. So I think there's, boundless potential for addressing the problem, and it's just about addressing it as it comes to us, right? And what the reality is based on the facts and the data. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the challenges with good data, because that's a real challenge, right? You have people that are in the shadows, that are underground. These are vulnerable groups, and by their nature, a lot of them are not identified. We don't know much about them. They don't want to have contact for government officials or law enforcement or for, immigration officials, for good reasons. So I think that, the first thing I want to do is just kind of talk a little bit about what is labor trafficking, right? Like, and I think that that's an area that also, labor trafficking is more subtle, and in some ways it's not something that we see very clear. So, in the United States, the form of human was made for task. These are the words that are really important through forced fraud, coercion. The other kind of big subcategories of labor trafficking are bonded labor or debt bondage. So that's labor demanded as a means of repayment for a loan or service. And that can be a ridiculous amount of money as an interest rate. So basically, they can never repay that. So they're bonded in that servitude. Forced labor is another big area, and then of course child labor. The other issues that I think are important to realize is that labor trafficking can be one of the most, or is the most prevalent form of human trafficking. And as I mentioned, they prey on vulnerable groups. So what are examples of those vulnerable groups? Runaway and homeless youth, immigrants without status, without documentation, foster care system, people with developmental disabilities. The list goes on. You have pathless resistance for perpetrators, traffickers. They go after people that are extremely vulnerable, that are in the shadows, that don't have a lot of connections, that may not want connection or have fear of, local officials, decision makers, law enforcement. And so that's a kind of general picture. It can also, with labor trafficking, what can be a challenge is it can be hidden behind a facade of legitimacy. On the surface, the labor can look legitimate. And I think that's also why it's subtle and insidious. What does it mean in practice? Coercion, right? Like, what is forced crime? Threats against home country. Trafficker is in the home country. Say the individual comes from Guatemala, they know where the family lives. That can be a real concern of the victim. They also know where the victim's at. They brought them to the United States, for example, right? And so that fear and that threat is really powerful. It can be withholding pay. It can be withholding food. It can be locks on the outside. It can be fences around the work site. You don't have the ability to leave, to come and go, freely. It can be seizing of travel documents. Say you're an immigrant, that you have documentation. You're here on a return visa, on a non-immigrant visa, right? Like you work in the agricultural industry, which we'll talk about in a little bit. They can also seize those travel documents. And that's something I actually worked with a test, the coalition, probably about 10 years ago, where it was illegal to seize. That's a really common practice by human traffickers. The other challenge is that proving law enforcement, right? It's one thing to show physically coercing someone, but when you talk about non-physical coercion, and that can again be the threat of I'm going to call out immigration on you, right? Like some employer that's not a good actor says to the person that's here on a short-term visa, I'm going to call Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. That's an example of physical coercion, and that's also a real challenge for law enforcement, for prosecutors to prove. Labor trafficking is extremely complicated. It's transnational. It can be very labor intensive to investigate and prosecute. What does that mean? It requires a lot of resources. What does that mean? It requires a lot of funding. So we'll get back and talk a little bit about some of the disparity between funding. And funding can be something kind of like people don't think it's that exciting compared to like legislation. But you know, the reality is, what can you do without funding? And it's important for law enforcement, for investigations, for victim services. There's a lot of NGOs that do victim service grants. I know there are really great and important NGOs that do that work, like I saw in Montana. It can be survivor aftercare, right? And so that funding is really, really crucial, because what can you do with that money? The other thing to keep in mind is trafficking can be a combination of labor trafficking, or it can start as sex or start as labor trafficking and end as sex. So it's also not clear cut in that sense. I think some other kind of general trafficking are domestic service.
I'm going to interrupt you real quick. You're breaking up a little bit, so it might
Okay.
work better if you turn off your camera for a little bit, and then we might be able to hear you better.
Okay. Is that helping at all?
Yeah, we'll try that for a little bit. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Let me try moving this a little closer to me. Okay. And just yeah, just let me know if that does break up. Okay. Thanks
Okay.
for letting me know.
Sorry.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
So yeah, so what I was saying is that the types of labor trafficking that are general are domestic servitude. And what does that mean? That's like live-in help. Maybe you need some help with elder care, but that's where you can have those situations of labor trafficking. Agricultural labor, working in fields and agriculture. That's the H-2A visa that we'll talk about in a little bit. That's a non-immigrant temporary visa for agricultural work. This is the one that's probably the most obvious, and I think the image we all think of: sweatshop, factory work. You know, people working in a place under really bad conditions for long hours without break and little pay. I think of an issue I worked on years ago where children in India were sewing soccer balls in a sweatshop, and they were doing it because their hands were small enough to do that type of work. Forced begging. This is another area. And this is something you may have experienced possibly when you're in a large city. Groups of children, often, between 5 and 20, are overseen by someone where they're forced to beg and basically make no money and in poor conditions and exploitation. And these trafficking gangs that are forced begging move from city to city every one week or 2 weeks. So they, if anybody starts to get attention, they just pick up and leave. Restaurant work is another, general area where I think you could have issues with, particularly immigrant labor and immigrant labor without documentation. So the prevalence of labor trafficking, that's a real challenge, right? Like the numbers, the research, the stats, there's all sorts of numbers that you'll hear and see as you work on this issue. The challenge is it's really hard to know with any real accuracy the numbers. We know it's a problem. There's no doubt about that, right? We know it's a significant problem. But again, think about it. People underground in the shadows, they don't want contact with government decision makers, local law enforcement. So that's a real challenge. I've worked with groups on this to try and have some data points that are really well established with the Uniform Crime Report, for example. That's a federal report I think the FBI does, where there's a series of crimes that they record each year. That helps kind of give a picture of the crime and how prevalent is it going up or going down? But that's not part of that crime report. What are the numbers? So let's just take some numbers that I think organizations have put forward that are credible. The Walk Free Foundation says there are 20 million people globally that are victims of forced labor. 20 million. And they say 4.8 million are being trafficked for sex. So 20 million labor trafficking, 4.8 million for trafficking of sex. The U.S. Department of Justice launched 220 federal trafficking prosecutions. They secured 475 convictions in 2019. but only 1 in 20 of those convictions involve forced labor. So 1 in 20, right? And we'll talk again about the numbers where it's clear that labor trafficking is a really significant problem. And this is the challenge where we have with, education and resources and authorities, that's really important. Another example I think is interesting is California, right? California is a huge state. The population is 39.5 million. If it was its own country, it'd be the 5th largest economy in the world. It obviously has a huge immigrant population, including a large undocumented immigrant population. They average less than 30 convictions a year for labor trafficking, 30. So again, think about that number and the kind of economy that they have and the numbers there. Northeastern University did a study about 10 years ago where they looked at 12 sites in the United States, and they found 140 total cases identified by law enforcement. Of those, 11% were labor trafficking. But victim service providers that Northeastern spoke with said that 80% of the human trafficking survivors they worked with were victims of labor trafficking, right? So 11% of the cases identified by law enforcement were labor trafficking, but you have the service providers, the NGOs, saying 80% of the population they work with labor trafficking. So something clearly is, out of whack, right? It's not correlating to what it should. The Montana in human trafficking, I did a little look into this just to kind of get a sense and a handle on it. You all know this much better than I do, but I think that, one of the statistics I saw that stood out to me was that there was a total of 93 calls, texts, or chat messages since it was launched in 2020, with 87 total contacts in 2021. 19 of those came from Missoula County, 15 from Gallatin County. Is that your county, I believe? The number that I saw that really stood out was that they said that the cases increased from 7 in 2015, this was from the Montana Department of Justice, to 68 in 2021. So, statistically, that's an 871% increase. Now, I don't think, I'm sure that doesn't mean there was this massive influx of trafficking. I think what it shows is the good work that Montana is doing with training and identification, with law enforcement, with people and different stakeholders and businesses, and getting the hotline promoted, and doing a lot of work with services and victim services and task forces that were mentioned earlier. All of that work is resulting in better identification, investigations, prosecutions, convictions, more victims that need victim services and survivor aftercare. And so I think that's an important thing just to mention and think about. I also saw a significant case you all may be aware of, that Louis Gregory Venning pled guilty in November of last year to coercing at least 15 women and girls into prostitution. All the survivors were from Billings, and he trafficked them across the state and country over a period of 8 years. And so that was a significant case, and kudos, to the law enforcement, the investigators, everyone that worked and had a part in that case. I thought one of the things that was really interesting, though, and I'd love for you all to look at this a little as we're talking, and we'll come back to this at the end, but I'd love for you to take a second and, Google, look on your phone, your tablet, your computer, and, Montana and human trafficking, Montana and sex trafficking. Google that, or Montana and labor trafficking, and then click through those results that you see, not just, how many results you get if you do human trafficking, and just see how often labor trafficking is mentioned versus sex trafficking. And I think that when I looked at this, I could quickly kind of tell and see how the issue was talked about. And it's different than the cases that are identified as sex trafficking or labor trafficking. That's the facts, and that's important. But just when people talk generally about trafficking, what was the context and how was the frame presented? And again, I think that, from what I was reading, I think it's really great. And I think Montana's doing a fantastic job. I've noticed too that law enforcement was talking about, for example, women in prostitution or sex work, that they should not be treated as criminals, and there's a real acknowledgement and understanding. That's been a really positive sea change in the last 15, 20 years, particularly obviously women that are forced into sex trafficking. you know, for a long time, they were treated as criminals and they had charges, right? And you think about how incredible that is, that through the coercion and the violence and all the exploitation, then, you know, to have convictions on your record. And when I work with survivors, this is the biggest thing survivors would talk about, is how they were unable to rebuild their lives, right? They couldn't get jobs, they couldn't get loans, they couldn't go to school, they couldn't buy, you know, or rent, and it's a huge issue. So keep that in mind if you work on this issue, that the vacate, you know, to get rid of the convictions of those that were, you know, for example, arrested on prostitution-related charges. That's really important to get that cleared. And I saw some legislation that was working on aspects of that, that was introduced in the state legislature in Montana this year. So again, great sign, but I think it's something really important to be aware of, and you know, continue for you all to work on. The other thing I think is really important is we don't want to create a hierarchy of victims, right? Like, this is the whole thing where I think we take and treat everybody equally, and however the problem is, we want to have a response and prevention and protection, all that as it's needed. So I think that's really important. You never want to create a hierarchy of victims. Victim is a victim, right? The other thing we've seen, and I think we've seen this really accelerate, I mean, it's been a big issue in the last 20 years, is the anti-immigrant sentiment. You know, the xenophobia, the nationalism, the white supremacy. It's been a big problem. It became a really, really big problem in, I think, the last 5 to 6 years. We have seen, you know, Donald Trump, when he ran as a candidate, you know, ran on very strong anti-immigrant or draconian immigrant policies, and building a wall, things like that. And that then became a lot of the policies that they enacted in his administration. We'll talk about some of those. And the other thing I'll add is that, you know, at least 2 of those policies that were begun in the Trump administration have been continued under the Biden administration. So one of them is poised to end soon. We'll talk about that, but I think it's important to look at, you know, both administrations and the problems that are going on in the response to trafficking. The stats that happened in the last several years are really common. You know, you can see that there was a 176% increase in anti-Latino hate crimes in America's largest cities in the first 2 weeks after the 2016 election. You know, the doubling of violent crimes committed against Asian Americans, that coupled with COVID epidemic and people lashing out at Asian Pacific Americans with COVID, a lot of, you know, really troubling hate crimes and bias and violence that we saw, and you know, with a lot of the overlay of white nationalism and white supremacy. And so a lot of this, you know, that I want to talk about too, is that there's policies that have happened on the immigration front. Remain in Mexico. This is a policy I'll talk about. Remain in Mexico was a policy where basically it started in the Trump administration, and if you were someone seeking protection, a migrant, asylum, you had to wait in Mexico for your U.S. immigration court case. What's the problem with that? Well, you're talking about people that are extremely vulnerable, that have nothing. It's a real issue that the border areas are fraught with violence, and they're very unsafe. There's a lot of issues with cartels and gangs and human traffickers. So you take people that are extremely vulnerable, that are fleeing and may have come hundreds or thousands of miles from places like the northern triangle of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and then you tell them they have to wait, you know, for their cases to happen in the U.S. And if you follow or work at all on immigration, there's a huge backlog. These cases take forever. So that's been a real problem, right? And there's the Remain in Mexico program. I call it Remain in Danger. I think it's a real problem. And this program does continue today under the Biden administration. There was an attempt to wind it down. There was cases, federal court cases, and those cases came on the side of reinstituting the Remain in Mexico program. And it's not only been reinstituted, but it looks like it will be expanded to all those that are coming to seek protection. And so, again, it's an example of a policy that's a real problem. And this is a program that creates vulnerability, and I think fosters human trafficking. And of course, this applies to all victims, right? Sex and labor. But, you know, particularly you have immigrants that are coming that are fleeing that need protection, particularly fleeing violence, femicides, gender-based violence, corruption, and then they have to wait on these border areas with nothing. It's a real problem. The other policy that I wanted to mention too, that the good news is it will be, there was an announcement a couple weeks ago, it'll be ending in about 2 months, I think in May. It's called Shorthand Title 42, and this is a code for the U.S. law. And it was a policy was put in place under the Trump administration, basically saying if there was, a pandemic or a contagious outbreak of disease in another country, the U.S. had the power, to not accept, to push back migrants and refugees that were trying to come to the United States. And so there's been a lot of opposition to this policy, a lot of opposition by health experts and people in the medical field saying, if anything, it's not helping, it's actually exacerbating, putting people extremely vulnerable in situations where they don't have access to medical care. It also has been shown to be a bit disingenuous, to be kind, to use that word kindly, I would say, in that, every week there's been millions of people crossing the border between the U.S. and Mexico. So certainly, that's not a real concern. It's really about, using it as a ruse to go after the immigration flow. And also it's looked, ridiculous with the travel bans ending and that states ending mask mandates. And so that policy is poised to end in about 2 months. I do anticipate, based on working on these issues over the last 6 years, that I think you will have huge influx of migrants, both those that are coming and haven't had a chance, to really come with Remain in Mexico and this Title 42, and also people are pooled up along the border. They're not going to have to make a journey of hundreds or thousands of miles. It'll take weeks. They're there. So I expect, unfortunately, you'll see another border crisis where the border and the Customs Border Patrol stations are overwhelmed. But I do think, it is a good thing to have that policy, and it's so people that need protection and seek protection, and that we have laws that, will require us to, have certain process to welcome those individuals, and have, we have international obligations as well, that those policies will return. So the other area too that I want to mention is the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. That is the underpinning of the U.S. government response to human trafficking. Trafficking in modern day slavery or slavery is an ancient problem. It's been around, and the U.S. has had the history of slavery and slave trade and all the history that goes with the issue and globally, with the issue. But the U.S. federal law was only passed in 2000 for human trafficking in this context, and that there's been several what they call reauthorizations or renewals, and it's just ways to update the law to, to give new powers, to provide more funding. Maybe there's a change that needs to happen in the law based on traffickers and how they're operating. And that's happened in 2003, 2005, 2008, 2013, and it's happened a couple times since then. One of the problems is that the law has to go through, in the Senate, it has to go through the Senate Judiciary Committee. It goes to the House and the Foreign Affairs Committee, because part of it is international and the U.S. and how the U.S. responds to trafficking internationally through Department of State. And then there's all the, authorities and powers that needed to be domestically. Problem with Senate Judiciary Committee is it's a really, really politicized committee. The Senate puts all the, kind of true believers on each side there, the Democrats and the Republicans. And so immigration is a really big contentious issue there. And what's happened over the years is that that there's a kind of standoff where immigration and positive and good immigration reform provisions aren't added to the trafficking bill, because procedurally, if you open something up for good, you open it up for bad. And the fear is it becomes kind of what they call a food fight, where they put a bunch of stuff in that's really strong enforcement or may take away some protections. So unfortunately, what you've had happen with the major trafficking legislation is little to no new language, authority law when it comes to foreign national or immigrant victims. So I just wanted to mention that, because it's a great opportunity to have things that are positive, but not only do you have policies that are negative, right? But you also have opportunities to do things affirmative that could be good changes. And because of how polarized and politicized immigration has become, you can't get that done even when it comes to human trafficking. So I just wanted to flag that as well. We talked about, we just talked about Remain in Mexico. We talked about the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. We talked about Title 42. The other thing I just wanted to touch on briefly is that there's a real challenge too in disparity in the funding. There's a lot of funding that goes for a lot of different aspects of trafficking. Just in the interest of time, I'll talk a little bit about victim service grants. Obviously, you need money to successfully help victims and provide victim services and survivor aftercare. I just, picked a few examples. There's a program that's ran out of Department of Justice. It's for minor victims of trafficking. $10 million total. 8 million of the 10 million went to minor victims of sex trafficking, and 2 million goes to victims of labor trafficking. And again, it's fantastic and important that this money goes to victims of sex trafficking, victims of labor trafficking. But my concern is that based on the need, right? Is are labor trafficking victims getting the money that they should as well? There's a part of Department of Labor that's called the International Labor Affairs Bureau, and that bureau is charged with countering human trafficking, child labor, and forced labor across the U.S. and around the world. The Secretary of Labor in, I think it was 2019, Secretary Acosta, he proposed cutting that budget by 90%, 90%. So not only do you have funding that is, huge disparity when it does address sex and labor, you have functions that are meant for labor that are being attempted to be cut by significant amounts. And you also have, and I'll mention this too, is just different funding programs that are only addressing sex trafficking, right? So there's not even any funding for labor trafficking. The other thing, some states I've seen, like Georgia, Louisiana, Oregon, they have funds that only apply to children, survivors of sex trafficking. And again, absolutely, let's get this money to children that are survivors of sex trafficking, but also there has to be a need for labor trafficking. So, where is that support and funding coming from? And again, you can look and you can take time to do some research. There's sometimes this sense when I've met and talked to people or decision makers that, quote unquote, labor trafficking is not that bad. You will find plenty of examples and see kind of, really terrible treatment in labor trafficking. There's plenty more I could go through on the funding side, but I just think that's a few examples. I think California has had some really good state reports that do, I think, a really kind of self-critical evaluation of their trafficking response, and they acknowledge that the funding for victim services is not what it should be. And then, they're not funding labor trafficking, and often it's exclusively for sex trafficking. So I think there's they call them I think the shorthand is Little Hoover reports. But I encourage you to take a look at those because I think it does a really good snapshot of the problem. There's plenty of other examples I could give, but I'll stop with that on the funding side. And then a couple other areas just I wanted to mention. One is foreign labor recruiters. Foreign labor contractors or recruiters are relied on to facilitate the migration of labor from one country to another. Again, the overwhelming majority of businesses that work in this space and get labor through short-term visas, non-immigrant visas, are good actors. They act appropriately. They do work that is correct. There are, as in anywhere, bad actors. And, the idea is with foreign labor recruiters, we need to weed out and have a system where we can have regulation and oversight so these foreign labor recruiters aren't a problem. What do the foreign labor recruiters do that's a problem? Well, first, they don't disclose what the job is really like, how the pay is. They also charge fees, to have the opportunity to have this short-term visa. Well, the fees for someone that really has nothing are really significant. And if they end up in a situation that is not a good situation, they don't have any money left to pay another fee. The other problem with these short-term visas that occur is they're not portable. So what that means is, like, you're an employer that provides a visa to, say, somebody to work in agriculture in New Hampshire and pick apples. if that situation is not a good situation, if the employee is not happy, um, that visa, if they leave, is terminated, is ended, and then they're unauthorized. They're not supposed to be here. And so what does that do? That gives a lot of power, disproportionate power between the employer and the employee. And so one of the things that's really important to do with these types of short-term visa like H-2A is to provide portability, right? So the person that's working can take that with them and they don't have it hanging over their head that the money they may be sending home through remittances to feed their family is not going to be taken away from them. Or if they pay that fee that was a huge sum for them, they're not going to have to try and pay it again, and then they won't have the money. But I think that the foreign labor contractors that are bad actors are often involved in trafficking of workers and exploiting these non-immigrant visa programs. They've long operated in a climate where they can have impunity, and they lure impoverished and desperate workers to the U.S., promise jobs that are described as lucrative and plentiful when it's not the case. And then they will charge the fees that force the workers to stay in abusive or exploitive working conditions. It can end up being debt bondage. And so they will also falsify documents, deceive workers about the terms and conditions of work. So how do we address that? It's real simple. We do three things. We have disclosure. So the labor contractor is required to disclose to the worker the full and complete information about the employment, and that they can't charge fees, these really high fees. And then the registration, so they have to get a certificate of registration, the labor recruiter from the Secretary of Labor. And then enforcement, right? Foreign labor contractors would be subject to administrative, civil, and criminal penalties for violations of the provision. And again, this is a pretty light touch, a reasonable touch. There's been multiple attempts in the last 20 years to get this bill passed as a standalone bill and also to get it into the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, but it has fallen short because of opposition by a lot of these kind of businesses and contractors. And so I think the other one I mentioned was H-2A and the importance of these short-term visas to have portability. I think that with that, I'm trying to see too, just T visas, CDC, make sure remain in Mexico. We just talked about that. And I do think there's been some, improvements and bright spots. The Biden administration had a national plan of action on human trafficking that really looked at the issue holistic and inclusive, and I think had a lot of equity between the different aspects of trafficking. Now, it's a plan, right? So the reality will be how is it implemented and how is it executed and what kind of oversight happens, and do they kind of follow the spirit of the plan when they put it in action. Ending Title 42, I think, is really significant and a good step. I also think, I often get questions asked by folks saying, what can I do? How can I help? How can I address this? I care a lot about this issue. I think there's a few things. One, support organizations, decision makers, policymakers that have a holistic and inclusive approach to human trafficking. I think, you can look and make sure that they look at sex trafficking and labor trafficking, that they look at U.S. citizens, foreign nationals, that adults and children, domestic, international. Domestic, international, that is not as much of an issue because some groups focus international, and that's understandable. But I think the labor and sex of foreign national U.S. citizen, the immigrant U.S. citizen, that's really important. I also always say support organizations that provide direct services. So what does that mean? Legal services, victim services, social services, psychosocial services. I think it's incredibly important when you have a group that's particularly if they're working on policy, whether it be in DC or if it's in your state legislature, that has a direct service component, so they're informed by the realities in the day-to-day life of the population that they're serving, right? Because if not, you kind of have this ivory tower detachment, and what you think might be really important for survivors or victims of trafficking may not all be what they really need, right? And so I think that's a really important piece of information in your work and a really important data point. And I also think that look for organizations that have survivors and victims, whether on staff, on the board, or as an advisory committee. A lot of the organizations I work with, and we had like a national survivor network that we worked with when I was at a test, the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking. I think that's really, really important. And, you know, imagine if everybody's having a conversation, you know, about you, but without you, right? And we know that's a really bad practice. And so I think it's critically important that, you know, they're at the head and not the tail, right? They're like involved in these discussions and really, you know, a fundamental aspect of when you're deciding what type of work to do and support. I also think it's really important to make sure you're following, to the extent you can, legitimate federal, state, and local groups and you know, leaders on the issue. That can be a little more difficult. I think that if you look at the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking on the national level, this does not include the state and local level, but that coalition and those organizations are credible organizations and do really good work. There's Freedom Network, which is a national coalition of groups that provide services, direct services to victims. That's a really great group and really credible. Other groups are CAST, that's out of Southern California, Polaris. Polaris is pretty well known, has a lot of name recognition. Safe Horizon. There's a number of groups, but I think it's really important to make sure that the group is legitimate. There is a lot of groups out there, and I'm blown away when I did this work that every week I would hear, like, you know, a number of groups that I hadn't heard of before. It doesn't mean that they're not doing good work, but I think, you know, it's really important to do your homework. I think also, you know, fact check, double check anything you see on social media or Facebook. There is a lot of misinformation out there. It's incredible, you know, and I've done this work for a while, and people, you know, just in my day-to-day life, I'll go to the dentist. They know me as like the human trafficking guy, and I'll have like the hygienist like ask me questions and things that she's seen that are just, you know, ridiculous. I mean, but she really cares. She wants to know, and so it's troubling to me the amount of misinformation and kind of this, you know, cinematic, kind of really over the top dramatic aspect of human trafficking that we hear. There could be examples like that, but I think the reality is that, you know, this isn't a movie, and I think having skepticism with counts that appear sensational or dramatic. I also think, you know, I'm also always careful when I see an organization that has sort of this savior mentality, or rescue mentality, and you'll read and see a lot on this, but I don't see it as much as it once did. But there was really this kind of paternalistic thing, particularly when it came to women, to save and to save women, and I think that's another aspect that's important. And I think with that, I want to make sure we have time for questions. I hope you have questions. I really encourage you to ask questions. There is no such thing as a dumb question, and I'd love to hear too if anybody had any thoughts too when they, you know, looked up trafficking in Montana, and if labor trafficking was addressed when you did that. But again, thank you very much for your time. Thanks to all you for, you know, taking the time to be here, and I'm happy too if you do work as an organization or want to talk further. You can get in touch with Ellie or others, and get in touch with me, and I'm happy to talk further. So with that, I'll end, and hopefully folks have a couple questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Cory. I'll start out with a question, and others can type theirs in the chat while they're thinking of their questions. But you mentioned kind of the disparity between resources that are provided to survivors of sex trafficking compared to labor trafficking victims. But a common misconception is that, you know, individuals don't, they either experience one or the other, but they often experience both. So they're not mutually exclusive. So what, in your mind, do you think would need to happen, whether a policy change or increased awareness about the reality of trafficking, to kind of distribute those resources more equitably?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think, you know, really looking at the information as it exists, right? I mean, the data is challenged, right? And I fully acknowledge that, and I worry about that because I think it could one day cause a lot of problems to really important work that's done on trafficking. But I think that we do have numbers, right, where we see cases and prosecutions and numbers of victims. And so, making sure that that's simply equitable. And I think, in you all involved in your daily work or any volunteer work or any kind of work you get involved, or whether you, once a year call, your representative or your senators on this issue, is really pushing them to have a proportionate response as needed and make sure that it's equitable and equal. When I first started this, I really mediated between a lot of groups, and there was a lot of siloing. And I remember being on conference calls, and I had to do a series of conference calls between two groups. One group worked on foreign national and immigrant victims of trafficking, the other worked on U.S. citizens. And I was like on a negotiation with them, and it was like we had to kind of go back and forth to agree on the number and how we're going to break the number down in our recommendations to appropriations and to budget on how much money goes for victim services for foreign national U.S. citizens. Now, over time, when they got to work with each other more, and they both kind of had their eyes open to the realities of the problem, both were really good organizations, did good work. But I see when people work on an experience that they really can't help but kind of view things in a much more holistic way. But I think it's, to the extent it's a kind of specialized type of service in some way. But yeah, I think that, just the facts and what's the data, to the extent you can have that and working to address the problem.
Thank you, Cory. So yeah, we have some questions in the chat. If you are you able to see those, or would you like me to read them?
Hold on one sec. What is your opinion on illegal immigration? Should we or could we be open more than just refugees? Well, I think I understand this question. I mean, one, I think that we should certainly, do our fair share with refugees and refugee resettlement. We should certainly be doing our fair share. I mean, there's a lot of stats when you see what the U.S. does compared to other countries, and particularly in recent years when it's been the number of like refugees, for example, that Germany's taken in from Syria. I think that there's a lot of challenges too with kind of race and national origin and how refugee populations are treated, just talking about refugees. But I think we could certainly do more, and I think that we're on the right road to do more on refugee protection and resettlement. On immigration, I mean, this system has been broken for a long time, and there's an inability by policymakers to get anything done. I think it's incredibly unfortunate. It's you have families that aren't reunited. You have labor protection issues, and the really interesting thing now is that, like the area I'm in right now, I'm near Notre Dame. I live near Notre Dame. I just saw that the unemployment rate here is 0.9%. Yeah, so they have a lot of places they don't even have jobs, and they don't have people to fill jobs. And so it's a different time period too. But I think that we should have a way for people like low and no skill to come, to come safely, legally, orderly, go through background checks and all those things have been talked about the last 20 years on immigration reform, but have a path to citizenship as well. And we can have border security. You have to have border security. That's going to be part of any agreement, but that we need to have a humane immigration system, and we have the ability, we have the need, and this is the reality is this is a country of immigrants. I mean, it's this incredible infusion of hard work and talent that's happened periodically, and it's all different sectors, whether it's Germans, Chinese, Japanese, and always hostility and discrimination when those groups come, whatever the dominant group is. But it's what has made America, and we have a real need for safe and humane immigration reform, and also for accepting greater numbers of refugees. Yeah, absolutely. What made you want to be an advocate for human trafficking victims? It's interesting. What I really liked about human trafficking, I'd worked on immigration, as I just discussed, on policy for that for several years, and everything was so politicized and so contentious. And I really liked human trafficking because you could get things done. You know, Republicans, Democrats would work on it. You could get law enforcement, you know, in working with victim services. A lot of the NGOs had good relationships with law enforcement, but there's just a lot of goodwill and a lot of bipartisanship. We were able to get things done. And then I came back to it. I got involved in it again with the child migrant crisis that started up in 2014 because there was a big, it's a long story, but the law that governed unaccompanied children, children that were coming to the border alone, was part of the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. And so I ended up working on that issue, moving over from trafficking because it was a real crisis and there was a real need for policy work at that point. And so, but yeah, I think it's, you know, I think it's being able to get things done and work across the ideological lines. And you don't have that on immigration. And it's nice to be able to do that and work in that way on human trafficking. Let's see here. I think that was it. Any other questions? Okay. Well, with that, you know, again, thank you and appreciate the time. And if you do have a question or, you know, want to have a conversation about this field or the work, you can get in touch with Ellie, others, and happy to have that conversation. So thank you very much for your time.